Hello, everybody. This is episode 27 and the last one for this week as we talk about international trade and its pros and cons. In the last episode, we talked about the potential benefit from specialization based on comparative advantage. We said, hey, you're right, if each nation specializes where they have the lowest opportunity cost and then trades with the other nation, that both nations could have a bigger pie of goods and services, consumption possibilities than they could produce on their own. So trade has a huge potential benefit because of specialization. What we're going to talk about this week in the start is the argument that yes, but we should restrict free trade. We should protect certain key interests for a variety of reasons. And we're going to look at the pros and cons of a variety of what we call protectionist arguments aimed at restricting free trade. We're also going to look at the economic implications of imposing a variety of trade barriers like embargoes and tariffs and quotas and a couple of others as we look through that section. And at the very end of the episode, then today, we'll talk about the story of some international trade organizations and some world trade pacts that have occurred in relatively recent years. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about protectionist arguments. This is on page 6 of your note set for this week. And, not everybody favors free trade, despite the potential benefits. And so if you want to have a name to put in the blank there, the individuals that call for limiting or the groups that call for limiting free trade, these arguments are called protectionism. Protectionism, right? They're grouped together. So why do some people favor limiting trade? Why do some groups favor limiting trade? And the basic story is because imports compete with domestic industries. If we buy goods from other countries, that's going to take away the ability of people in this country to produce and cause some harm. So that's one of the reasons, along with some others as well. So obviously, those folks that are affected in the United States, for example, want to be protected because they don't want to lose their jobs and they don't want to lose their source of income. They have an economic interest in restricting trade, and it's going to redistribute the benefits. What we do know is that if we do restrict trade, and there may be justification, some arguments are very strong for this, but if we do restrict trade, the last bullet there in this section says that if we do put those restrictions on to protect specific microeconomic interests, specific industries, specific individuals, what will happen is it will reduce, there's the blank, reduce the total gains from trade. So the total pie we could get from trade is going to be diminished for our nation and the other nations, in the interest of benefiting those special interest groups, those individuals that we are protecting. Perhaps that's worth it. Sometimes I think it definitely is. Sometimes it's probably not. And the story is going to look at those pros and cons. What are some other interests, though, or some other arguments why we might want to restrict trade? Besides just the, hey, buy American, we're competing with other countries, protect our jobs and incomes for those people in those key industries. And one argument that I think has a lot of validity is when we want to protect or limit trade, we want to limit trade because of national security interests. So obviously, if we're producing some new military technology that we don't want to have fall into the hands of our potential enemies, and they say, hey, trade with us, we'd like to trade with you for something else, our country might be justified in saying, no, we're going to block it, right? We're not going to trade, even though we could have more consumption possibilities. The potential risk to our national security is just not worth it, and so no, we're not going to trade. So that's the national security argument. I think there's some validity there, a lot of validity there in certain cases, and so that makes a lot of sense. A second argument that gets used also sometimes has validity, although this one's hard to prosecute, hard to prove, but it is something called the anti-dumping argument. And dumping in economics, when it comes to international trade, has actually a couple of meanings. Dumping, the first way that it's often used is that it means that a nation sells their product on another country's shores below the price they're charging in their own country, right? So the price when it comes to trade is less than the price in the domestic country. So they sell it for less than they're selling it at home. And the argument is that that's dumping. And the answer is, I can kind of see that, but if the story is that, this price that they're charging for trade still is above their cost of production and they're just being ultra competitive to try to find their way into that market, I don't find that quite so problematic. The other definition of dumping I find highly problematic. And that's the story that a lot of times countries will dump their products on another country's shores and price it below their actual domestic cost of production. So they'll actually sell it at a loss to be completely predatory, to take over that other market and drive out domestic producers and then capture it for themselves. So this would be a case where the trade price, right, is less than the actual price to produce in their country. So they're actually selling it specifically at a price less than the cost to produce it in their country. And that sort of dumping is definitely predatory. Right? You're trying to prey on the domestic producers in the nation that you're trying to trade with. You're saying, hey, we're going to come in here with a vengeance. We're going to come in here and we're going to charge a price lower than what it costs us to produce. Can't do that forever, of course, but we're going to do it for now because we want to drive out the domestic producers in that nation. And then once we've driven them out, we've captured the market. We can raise our prices and have monopoly power. And that is very, very nasty and predatory. The U.S. laws say that dumping is illegal, but it's very, very difficult to prove. Very, very difficult to prosecute and actually make it change. Sometimes what happens is if we do get a sense and prove it, then we put on massive tariffs and other restrictions to make those imports not as affordable and not able to compete. But the story is it's very, very difficult to prove and enforce and all that other sort of stuff. It is an argument as to why we might consider restricting trade and has some validity, but there are some real-world challenges with applying this particular argument. Now, we don't like it when other countries dump their products on our shores, but a lot of other countries counter and say, yeah, but the story is you dump a lot of your products, United States, on other nations' shores. Let me give you one example. One example is they argue that we oftentimes dump agricultural products on foreign nations. The United States, the actual cost to produce basic grains and cotton and all of that kind of stuff is actually considerably lower than the price farmers sell it for. Actually higher, excuse me, I take that back. The price that it costs to produce that corn and dairy and grain and all the rest is actually higher than what it actually sells for on the world market. And the reason is because the US government massively comes in and subsidizes those producers. And I'm not saying that's all good or all bad, but the story is we do. We have huge subsidies in the agricultural markets. And so what that does is it encourages, because the government is giving the money to those farmers, that shifts the supply curve to the right. And when that happens, right, the price falls that they can sell it for because the government, i.e. you and I, are picking up that tab. And then when it goes into foreign markets where those producers don't have those protections, they don't have those government subsidies, they can't compete, right? And so what happens is U.S. production drives out domestic farm production, and those workers then are subject, and those people in those countries are really subject to the whims of the global market. So that if there's a drought or a shortage or something like that, and corn prices get dramatically high in the United States, the people that need that basic corn from other parts of the world, the price is dramatically high. And when people are on the edge of starvation, on the edge of hunger, on the edge of poverty, that small increase in the price of a corn tortilla, for example, makes a huge difference in terms of whether people live or die. So they argue in many countries in the world that the United States talks they can't dump on our shores, but then we end up dumping on their shores. And it is an argument that goes back and forth. It's a very, very volatile thing. Follow the money. There's a lot of challenges here. So what's a third argument? So we looked at so far the arguments of national security and anti-dumping arguments to favor trade restrictions. A third argument why we might restrict free trade is called the infant industry argument. And infant industries are industries that are just kind of getting going, right? They're infants, they're babies. They're just learning to walk, and it takes a while to walk. And if they have to compete with the big boys, the bullies that already exist in the market, they're not going to make it. And so what these new industries in a given country that are trying to compete with the existing industries do is they go to their government and they say, protect us, right? Help us out for a while. Insulate us from competition. Give us a chance to get going. And once we get going, we're going to be able to compete with those big boys and girls easily, right? But we need a little help right now. We need you to hold our hand, just like an infant, as we're starting to walk. so that once we grow big enough where we can walk on our own, we can run and we can truly compete and outrace those existing firms. If we don't do that, if we don't get that chance, we're never going to make it. And there's something compelling about that argument at one level. You're like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Give those firms a chance. And we've had a lot of those protections put in place. For example, in alternative energy sectors. For example, solar panel production, other sorts of things are much more developed in a lot of other countries in the world. They're able to mass produce those solar panels and other things and much more cheaply than U.S. companies have been able to do it historically. And so those companies have said, give us protection, government, right? Put some tariffs on those imported solar panels, give us some subsidies so we can go out and compete and all of that. And they've often been successful at doing that. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, there's some dead weight loss and inefficiency that we argued before, but if it's socially desirable in the long run, it might be worth it in the short run. The problem with these arguments is that in the real world, once the protections are given and the infant is helped along, the company doesn't want the government to let go of its hand. The company begs and pleads, no, we just need those subsidies for a little bit longer. Keep helping us out. Keep holding our hand. And politically, the politicians don't want to let go because that means they're going to lose the votes of that special interest group in that particular industry. And they're really not going to gain many votes in any other part of the sector of the economy. So the story is politically, there's not a big advantage to taking off those protections. Once they get out in the books and once they get out there, it's oftentimes very challenging to remove them. And they oftentimes go on way too long. So, there are stories here. One compelling example has to do with things like rare earth minerals. The rare earth minerals are those trace minerals that are all over the place when it comes to electronic products, cell phones and laptops and computers and all of that kind of stuff. And right now, a lot of those sources are coming from developing countries and from China has a huge industry in that and other places. And because we need those so badly, and we actually have the resources, many of them, not all of them, but many of them in underground here in the United States, those mining operations and those extraction operations are saying, hey, help us get going here so we can compete with the existing firms so we're more independent, right? Just like oil independence or energy independence, the idea is rare earth mineral independence. And there's been a lot of political pressure, twisting of arms to say, protect us. Could be good in the short run if they don't, keep on doing that in the long run in terms of kind of overstaying their hand or holding the hand of the government. They don't want to let go. We don't want the government to let go. It could be a beneficial thing, but it is challenging in reality. And then the last of the arguments I'm going to talk about why we might argue for protectionism, y'all probably know about is the argument of, well, free trade sounds good, but it's not fair. Anytime you put the word free in something, it gets the connotation that it's always great, that it's always perfect, that it's always the best. Free markets are the best, right? Well, what do you mean by free markets, right? There's no such thing as a truly free market. There are always rules and regulations. The question is, how free do you mean? Or when it comes to free trade, again, it sounds like, well, that's great. I mean, everybody can do whatever they want, what's best for them. And the answer is, yeah, but is it fair, right? In some fundamental sense of fairness, efficiency versus equity, the biggest pie versus the distribution of the slices of those pie. And so when it comes to international trade, I'm sure you've seen like the fair trade logo, or you've heard about fair trade coffee or fair trade chocolate or fair trade clothing or those kinds of things. And the argument is that what we're going to do is for those industries where it's coffee, for example, the firms that sell fair trade coffee guarantee that they are paying the workers, right, who harvest those beans and process those beans a living wage, a fair, just wage, right? And that oftentimes, in most of the situations, those companies that pay those workers invest a certain amount of the profits back into the communities where those people come from. So they help invest in things like good schools and good sanitation and access to water and electricity and those fundamentals that we kind of take for granted. The story is that in those nations, the companies agree they're going to be socially responsible in that sense and help not only the individual workers make a living, but their communities thrive. That means, of course, as consumers of that coffee, you're going to pay a little more than for the coffee produced by the companies that don't take those steps to pay higher wages and do those other protections and all of that, or to protect the environment. But the story is that it's socially worth it to people. And so if that's the case, right, then there might be an argument to say free trade should be restricted. It should be a fair trade argument, not a free trade argument. And lots of groups come together when it comes to these sorts of arguments. Workers groups, feel like the workers are being exploited in existing situations where there's not fair trade, and those workers should be protected and have the right to determine their own destiny to a greater extent. It's oftentimes any group that feels like human rights violations are being done in the name of capitalism and monopoly profits. And so there's a lot of people calling for this. The question is, will U.S. consumers continue to vote with their dollars in ways that make those sorts of situations economically viable? But it is an argument to restrict free trade in the name of some broader sense of fairness. Okay? So what I want to do is talk about specific barriers that may be erected in order to try to limit free trade. And these barriers take a lot of different dimensions, and then we'll look at the economic analysis of each of these. Some barriers are all-out bans, like an embargo. Others are less complete in the sense of tariffs and quotas and voluntary restraint agreements and restrictive procurement practices and a whole bunch of others we're going to look at. Okay, so we're going to look at the types of barriers to entry and then the economics of this right now. So the first type of barrier to trade, to protection, the strongest one, is an all-out embargo, right? So an embargo is an all-out ban, right? Is an all-out ban on the trade of specific goods or services. So it's an all-out ban on the trade of specific goods or services, right, with certain countries. So an embargo is an all-out ban on the trade of specific goods or services with certain countries, and maybe for a certain period of time. So you say, hey, we're just not going to trade with you. It's an ultimatum that says we won't trade. And an example, probably the most famous, definitely the longest lasting embargo in U.S. history, has to do with the embargo that President Kennedy placed on trading with Cuba. Of course, with the Fidel Castro regime, and when Castro ultimately ended up going toward the communist socialist bloc, in the 1960s and 50s, late 50s, early 60s, the story was that President Kennedy put on an embargo, a trade embargo with Cuba, and that embargo has been going on ever since. We don't trade for the most part. There's a few little breaks in that, but the story is, generally speaking, that embargo is still in place. That's a long-lasting thing, and the argument is we don't want to support. That's what Kennedy argued, and other presidents have confirmed or affirmed. We don't want to trade with the communist regime just to the south of Florida. And so there's an embargo, right? We can't trade. That's obviously the strongest form of limiting trade, is an all-out ban. Okay? We don't do those very often. Usually they happen in times of war, times of national emergency. The story with the Cuban one was that it had a great deal to do with the situation with the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that, where the Cubans brought in Soviet nuclear weapons and missiles and put them on Cuba. And America asked them to take them out of our hemisphere, and there was huge tension. It was probably the closest, in fact, I would argue 1963, that was the closest that we ever came to having a nuclear disaster, a nuclear war that would have devastated this planet. Incredibly tense times, to say the least, and so we put an embargo on to try to pressure Cuba to saying that we don't support what you're doing. Thankfully, the crisis was avoided, but the story is the embargo still continues. A second type of trade barrier, which is much less restrictive and much more common, is to put on a tariff. Excuse me. A tariff, as you see there, the term tariff is simply a tax on an imported good. Tariff is a tax on imported goods or services, a tax on imports. Sometimes a tariff or this tax on imports is called a duty. So, when you go through an international checkpoint, you come through, the airport or whatever, they look at the duty office or the duty officer, and the story is that's the tariff officer, and they're thinking about and looking at the application of taxes to those goods that you're bringing in, right? Or when cargo ships are coming across from other countries or from our country to another nation, they're inspected at the port of entry, and there are tariffs or taxes placed on those. They're sometimes called duties, but we call them a tariff, right? A tax on imports, imported goods or services. The idea, of course, of a tariff is to make that imported good more expensive so that domestically produced goods can compete. So if we put on a 20% tariff, that jacks up the price 20% in the US market of those imports, and that allows US produced goods perhaps to compete more efficiently, saving some US jobs. In fact, it looks like a really attractive way to go, right? If we have a situation where we want to have more US employment and less unemployment, why don't we just slap on tariffs on imports, and then those folks that are unemployed could produce it here, and we could solve all of our domestic problems, our recessions and depressions and all of those kinds of things, our jobless recoveries. And in fact, historically, that has been politically very popular. Just to give you one quick example, and I'm not going to talk like Ben Stein, I hope, in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but in the 1930s, with the Great Depression, there was a huge push to say, well, our problem is that we're importing stuff from other countries. One of our problems, let's stop that and we'll be better off. We'll improve the economy. And they passed a very restrictive tariff bill called the Hawley-Smoot or Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, right? Which dramatically increased tariffs on imports. The problem was that the rest of the world, when we stopped buying from them because of those huge imports, they stopped buying from us. And so what it actually did was take the Great Depression and made it that much greater, that much deeper, that much worse, because we didn't want to play with them, and so they said, well, we're not going to play with you either. And the effect was rather devastating on the U.S. Economy in the 1930s. So tariffs, you can look online, Google for current tariff rates and all that kind of stuff at the Census Bureau or Foreign Trade Division stuff, and see what those are like. A third type of restriction, this is on the next page, is a quota. And a quota has the same effects as a tariff in the sense of restricting the amount of trade, but it's more direct, and it can be in many ways more harmful because it says we're only going to have a specific limit, right? A specific amount of that good or service that can come in a given period of time, and that's it. No matter what the price is, it doesn't matter. That's your quota. So if you're putting a definition, a quota, I don't know why I can't write very well today, but a quota is a specific limit, right? And it can come in terms of the quantity of something or the amount. So for example, when it comes to certain items like textiles, for a while we had a quota on the numbers of tons of foreign produced textiles that could be imported into the United States. Or it may be a physical quantity, right, that you can bring only so many thousands of vehicles, cars into the United States in a particular period, not by weight, but by quantity. So it's a specific limit, right, quantity or amount, on the import of a given good or service. So it's a specific limit on the import of a given good or service in a given time period, let's say per month or per year, from particular countries. Or it may be a global one as well. So a specific limit on the import of a given good or service in a given time period for particular countries. So it's a quota. It says this is all you can bring. You can bring up to this amount, no more. Right? We won't let any more in, no matter what the price is. This is all you can bring into the country. And so while the general impact is the same as the tariff in restricting trade, the actual effect can be a little different, and we'll show that economically with supply and demand model in just a little bit. If you're writing out an example again, you could think about the story of the textile industry, where again, for a long time, we had quotas that said you can only bring in this many tons of textiles from, foreign countries in a given year, and that was it, right? No matter what. To try to help U.S. textile producers stay in business or at least gradually transition out of that business into new businesses, because the textile industry has not been doing very well in the United States for a very long time due to a lot of cheap imports. Most of our clothes are not made in the United States anymore, right? That kind of story. A couple more barriers to entry, and then we'll do the economics. A fourth one is called a VRA, or a voluntary restraint agreement. A voluntary restraint agreement is a slight variation on quotas that's been used in recent trade negotiations. And the key here is that it's voluntary, right? So what it basically is a voluntary decision, not formalized, right? Not in writing, but it's a voluntary, not formalized quota on imports, right? Or exports for that matter. You can take it on both sides here. So it's a voluntary, not formalized quota on imports and exports. So what that means is that two countries might be getting together and talking about trade agreements for specific goods or services. And rather than signing this formal document that says this is how much we're going to bring in and no more, it's all I'm going to let you bring in, the story is that it's much more informal or voluntary. So each nation agrees in principle that they'll only, sell with to the other nation this amount in a given period of time, but they don't actually sign their name to the dotted line and make it a legally binding sort of contract. Rather, what they do is we say, this is what we're going to do. And the reason that that's become more popular is because it politically is less harsh, going back to your country and saying, well, this is all we were able to procure, and we signed it legally, so we can't do anything about it. This one says we're going to try our darndest, but if things change, we reserve the right to back out and do what we want to do anyway. And so it's not as strong, nearly as strong as the other ones, but the story is it's become politically more popular. And so we've seen a growth in these in recent years. And then the last trade barrier I want to talk about before we do the graphs, I want to tell you a joke in just a minute too, have to do with other things that we haven't talked about so far. The ones we've talked about really are just the tip of the iceberg, but there are lots of other things that limit goods and services coming into our nation or other nations taking our goods and services. For example, we have things like licensing requirements, right? Unless you have a license to do this, you just can't come in and sell your product in the United States. You have to have a license. And we control the rules and the access to those licensing criteria and education. And so that limits the ability of people from outside to compete. That limits competition and foreign trade. We also have restrictive procurement practices and informal, unspoken quality standards. One thing you might think about is that pharmaceuticals are really expensive in the United States. Lots of other places in the world, those same pharmaceuticals are sold much more inexpensively. And so the argument is, well, why couldn't we just import those drugs, which are equivalent in their impact and their chemistry from other countries, and therefore compete and lower the price of our healthcare. But the problem is that we say that we can't verify the quality. That you have to have a FDA approval, and there's some validity to that, but there's also a cost to that, which is that we can't have access to all of the worldwide market on some of these things, and that leads to much more monopoly power. Just for example, in the pharmaceuticals, there are other examples. I'm not just picking on the drug industry, but other examples as well. Or here's one. I'd encourage you, if you ever get a chance. This movie's a little bit biased. Well, actually, it's quite a bit biased in some ways. But there's a good movie out there. It's a little old now, called Life and Debt, and I know you can see it online, probably for free. And the story is that it looks at the situation of the country of Jamaica, Yaman. And this, I don't have dreads or any of that kind of stuff. But the story is that in Jamaica, of course, was a colony of Great Britain. And they were a colony of Great Britain for a long time. And when the British finally, stopped their imperialistic colonization and went out of Jamaica, Jamaica was on the road to economic freedom. Well, one of the things that Jamaica had produced a great deal of, and still does, was bananas. So during the age of colonialization, lots of big banana companies went in and formed these huge banana plantations, and then they took those products and sold them to the rest of the world. the key was, though, that those big corporations, treated their bananas and sprayed their bananas, and they made them all look like what we think bananas ought to look like, right? Pretty long, yellow without lots of blemishes, the bananas we're used to. And in their natural state, bananas don't always grow that long, and they don't always have quite that perfect outer texture that's not likely to bruise as much and all of that. And so when the Jamaican domestic banana producers decided they were going to try to sell their bananas, not the big Chiquita and Dole and all those, but the domestic producers, they couldn't find a market. And they said, what's wrong with our bananas? They're perfectly fine, right? They're healthy and all that. And the answer was, yeah, but they don't meet our quality standards. What the American consumer is willing to buy and sort of been told this is what a banana should look like. And so as a result of that, right, we greatly restricted. Jamaica, as a result, had a heck of a time. Other things going on too in Jamaica. But the story is that a lot of countries wouldn't buy Jamaican bananas. And so that was, kind of their product, and they couldn't really find much of a market. Great Britain bought them because they felt kind of guilty, I think, about the whole colonization thing, but lots of other countries would not do so. So there's lots of examples of how and why and when we restrict trade, and these are just a few of those barriers. So I want to turn our attention to the economics of this, actually looking at the market supply and demand graphs for these different barriers. Before we do that, maybe I'll tell you a quick little joke here, right? There was this old woman, this old lady, and the story was that she had been always very, very frugal in her life, and she was really getting up there in years, right? She never wasted a dime on anything, just was really incredibly frugal, right? Very much an economizer. And as she was getting up in years, one day she decided on a whim to take the public transportation, the bus. She didn't have a car of her own, downtown, and she was looking around, and she walked by this sports car dealership. And she'd always loved looking at fancy cars. She watched NASCAR and all that kind of stuff, and she just liked fancy cars. And she went into the sports car dealership just on a whim and looked, and she said to the dealer, who happened to ask her, "May I help you?" She said, I was just looking, and I was just wondering, just out of curiosity, what's the fanciest car you have, right? What's the most expensive car you have? And the dealer said, well, right here, the one in the center of the showroom. And she looked at it, and her eyes just glazed over, and she's like, oh my gosh, right, what a beautiful car. And she asked him some of the details, and he explained all of its features and all of its that kind of stuff. And the story was the woman was enamored. And she's like, can't believe I'm asking you this, but would it be okay to sit in it? And the dealer said, sure, absolutely, no problem. And so, he opened the door, the hatch, and she sat in it. And she was like, wowed. I mean, it just had so many incredible features, and she was like in heaven. And she's just having quite a day, right? And she can't believe she asked this, but she says, I'm just wondering, can I take it for a test drive? She said, I've got the money. I could buy this if I wanted to. I've always been frugal, never wasted. I could buy this, but I wouldn't want to do anything like that unless I could take it for a spin. And the dealer said, well, of course, right? I would expect as much. So he gave her the key. He said, you go out and take it for a drive, test it out, and let me know what you think. And when you come back, we'll talk, right? So she put the key in the ignition, and she turned over the engine, and you hear this sound, right? She's like, oh, this is going to be a great day. And so she, drives the car carefully, off the lot and out of the showroom and off the lot and out through town. And she's going slowly and trying some of the features. And she gets to the edge of town where the speed limit increases, and she floors that sucker. And you should see the acceleration on that baby. She is in heaven, right? That car is accelerating and turning the corners, handling, and everything else like she has never experienced in life. And she is falling in love. And she's thinking to herself, you know what? I don't believe I'm saying this, but I think I'm going to buy this car. And as she turns around and she's coming back to the dealer, she's enjoying everything, and then she's trying to see where the sound system is, right? Because she always likes good music. She's always been a huge music fan, and she can't find the button or whatever to get the radio going. So when she gets back to the dealer, this is a long joke, sorry. When she gets back to the dealership, she says to the dealer, it's a sweet ride, man, right? Sweet set of wheels. I don't know what they say anymore. But the story is gnarly. Nobody says gnarly. The story is a sweet set of wheels, a sweet ride, she says, and I'm thinking about buying it, really strongly thinking about it, but it doesn't seem to have a sound system or radio. And the man said, oh, that's my bad, right? I forgot to tell you. I meant to tell you when I was explaining things earlier that it has one of those new fancy voice-activated radios. So you just tell it what you want it to play, and it has a sound system that is absolute, positive, state-of-the-art, nothing better out there, a sound system that will absolutely blow your socks off, right? And he says, try something. He said, just say what you want it to play, and the radio will just overwhelm you. And she says, all right, classical. And you hear the radio click, right? And it comes on, and these gorgeous strains of Paganini's Violin Concerto just come wafting over her, and she melts like butter. Oh my God, what a great sound. Y'all love Paganini, right? Good stuff. But the story is she's like melting like butter, and he goes, all right, try something else. And she says, all right, country and western. And you hear the radio click on, and Garth Brooks, right, doing his thing. Like, she's like big Garth Brooks fan, you know. The story is like, wow, the sound is just incredible. She says, young man, I'm buying this car. Can't believe I'm saying it, but I'm buying this car. And so she gets out of the car, and she goes and takes care of all the paperwork and all of that. She gets back in the car, driving it home. And she, you know, driving along, and she'd already tried country and classical, so she's, you know, going through town, and she says, blues. And click, the radio comes on, and this time it's B.B. King doing his thing, right? And just having a great old time, and she's like, wow, right? This is the best. I mean, this is just incredible. And so she's enjoying that, and she got tired of that a little bit, so she says, New Age. And the radio clicks on, and this time it's Yanni at the Acropolis, and she's like, woo, why did I do that for? Anyway, the point is, long story, the point is here that as she's driving and listening to the radio, she's not really paying attention to all of her driving. She's a bit distracted, plus it's been a big day for her, right? Spent a lot of money on something she never thought she'd do, and she's kind of, you know, thinking about different things. And as she's driving along, she comes up to this intersection, and her light turned red a while back before she got into the intersection. She didn't realize it, and there was cars coming from the other direction. And at the very last second, out of the corner of her eye, right, peripheral vision, she happened to spot this motion on the other side of this car, and she whipped her wheel as fast as she could, and she barely avoided a collision, only missed the other car by that much. Now, she thought she was still right because she never saw the light turn red, huh? So she rolls down the window, and at the top of her voice, she yells, "Loser!" And the radio clicks on and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an afternoon of Chicago Cubs baseball." Or Chicago Bears football. That's the longest Cub joke you're ever going to hear. Hopefully not a bad one, but I hope you enjoyed that one. So let's look at the economics of free trade versus protectionism and all of the different types of barriers to entry. So we're going to start on page 9. Sorry about the squeaky marker. Going to start on page 9 with the base case. And the base case is that our nation doesn't trade with anybody, right? We are Fortress America. We build a wall around our borders. We put a roof over top of our country, and nothing goes out, and we don't bring anything in, right? So if we don't trade with anybody, then the equilibrium, price and quantity, how much we'll get and what we'll pay for it, will be determined by domestic supply and demand. U.S. producers, U.S. consumers determining what things are worth. So the no trade case is very straightforward. Looks like this. Here's the price. Here's the quantity. Here's domestic demand, right? D1. Here's U.S. supply, all by U.S. producers. And here's the price, right? So we will pay P1, and we will produce Q1, right? All by ourselves in the United States. So when you fill in the blanks underneath, domestic production is Q1. And the amount of imports, the second blank, is 0, because we're not trading with anybody here. And so that is our starting case. That's what would happen if we build Fortress America. So let's take that then and extend it to the next page and look at the question of, well, what if we tear down that wall and we trade freely, right? There's no barriers whatsoever. Anything that wants to come in, if it competes with U.S. firms, can do so. We can sell to the rest of the world. In that case, what's going to happen? Well, the demand curve is the same, right? Demand curve D1 here is the same D1 as on the previous page. This is domestic demand. This is what U.S. consumers want to buy, their maximum willingness to pay, and all that jazz. The supply curve, though, now is partly U.S. firms and partly from firms that are producing in the rest of the world. And so here's the story. P2, if you want to label P2, and I'd ask you to put this on here, is the world free trade price. So if we allow global production, right, to compete with U.S. industries, that's the price that's actually going to exist in terms of free trade. That's the price we're going to pay for goods and services. So what happens here? Well, there are some U.S. firms that are able to produce at a price of P2 or less. Those are the really cost-efficient, cost-effective, cheap, efficient U.S. producers. And so they're going to produce up to this quantity, right? So we call that QD on your sheet there. And then all of the rest of the supply is going to come from global producers. So the supply here with free trade is S2. And so only QD is going to be produced by U.S. firms. The rest of the supply would come from the global market. The new equilibrium, by the way, where supply and demand now intersect is out here, right at point B. And that's at a quantity of Q2, as it says on your sheet. Okay. So let's answer the questions underneath the graph. What's the level of domestic production, U.S. production now, under free trade? QD, right? That's how much is produced by the low-cost U.S. producers. These on the supply curve, the domestic supply curve, are U.S. producers that can compete. They will be okay with global trade, right? So QD. How much are the level of imports here? Well, here's the total amount we get, right? Q2 we get, and we pay P2 for it. QD of that is produced by U.S. firms. So the difference is the amount that we buy from outside our borders, the amount of imports. So if you want to write it down, it's Q2, the total we get, minus the amount domestically produced, QD. That's the amount of imports. Okay? That's what we bring in from other countries. What's the loss of U.S. production? The next blank. How many jobs are lost in the United States, or how much production is lost when we go from a situation of no trade to a situation of completely free trade? Well, with no trade, we would have had Q1 produced by U.S. businesses. Now we only have QD. So the loss of U.S. jobs is that. Loss of U.S. production. It says loss of U.S. production is equal to Q1, which we would have had with the Fortress America, minus the QD we now have with free trade. So the difference is how many jobs or how much production is lost because of globalization. All right? So then the question is, who are the winners and who are the losers from this unrestricted free trade? Who wins? Who's better off because of the free trade, the S2 story, as opposed to just the no trade? Well, one winner, of course, is the consumers. Consumers don't pay P1 anymore, they pay P2, a much lower price. So consumers win when we have free trade, right? Because of global trade, lots of things are cheaper at the store. You know, clothing's a lot cheaper than if we had it all produced in the United States, for example. And the other winner here, yeah, foreign producers, right? They're able to sell this amount, QD up to Q2 as imports for that country, their exports, those countries, their exports. And so foreign producers also win because they're able to sell their product on our shores. Consumers win, foreign producers win. Who loses? Yeah, some domestic producers, right? Some U.S. firms are going to lose their ability to compete. So we lose, you know, Q1 minus QD, that loss of U.S. production. Some domestic producers lose. But consumers win, and foreigners, producers win. And the question is, on net, are we better off or worse off? And the answer is, in total, we're probably better off when it comes to just the total trade. But individual groups are worse off. Plus, we have to be concerned with the environment and human rights issues and all that other stuff, which does make this really, really complex issue. This is just the real basics, okay? All right, so let's take that and go to the next page and say, well, okay, we just looked at the free trade case with this green demand curve, right? What if we put on some limits on that? What if we put on some barriers? What if we restrict free trade? What happens, for example, if you look on the next, on page 11 there, if we put on a tariff, right? So we put on a tariff, a tax on goods from other countries that are imported. Now suppose that tariff is equal to T, right? That's the amount of the tariff, X number of dollars or X percent. So what's the price going to be now of imports that we bring in from the rest of the world? Well, the price is now going to be equal to P3, right? And P3 here is equal to the old world price, the free trade world price, plus the tariff, right? Plus the tariff. And so P3 is just equal. If you want to shift it here, you're going to have the supply curve go up until it gets to P3. And then it's going to shift over, or go over horizontally, excuse me, as S3. This distance between the two being the amount of the tax. That distance being the amount of the tariff. All right. So that is the amount of the tariff. It shifts up, and I'm not supposed to say up when you shift the supply curve, but actually it's a better way to do it this time. So I don't mean to swear at you or anything like that from earlier, but story is it shifts it up by the amount of the tax, the tariff. So what happens now when we put on this tariff and restrict trade? Well, it's pretty straightforward, right? Domestic production is now equal to, for that first blank underneath, domestic production is now equal to QT, because all of these firms can compete with the higher priced imports due to that tariff. Imports are equal to the total that we consume, which is out here, which is Q3, already on your sheet. That's the total we're going to buy at that higher price because quantity demand will be less, law of demand holds. But the imports will equal this distance, right? The total amount we get, Q3, minus the amount produced by U.S. firms is the amount of imports. Right? Who wins because of this tariff? Well, these producers, right? These U.S. producers. The U.S. gain in production is the difference between QD, what we would have had under completely free trade, and QT, which is actually produced here because of that tariff restriction. So QT minus QD is equal to the gain in production due to the tariffs. Right? So some people are able to keep their jobs here and their incomes because of that tariff. Right? So then who wins? If you're feeling the next answer, who wins when we have tariff-restricted trade? Yeah, these domestic producers and workers, right? They are going to be able to keep their jobs because of that tariff. So they win. Some domestic producers are able to keep in business and keep paying their workers, okay? Who loses? The second blank, because of putting on this tariff instead of free trade. Consumers lose, right? Because we pay higher prices and get less output, right? So consumers clearly lose. And the other folks that lose are the foreign producers. So consumers lose and foreign producers lose. Consumers because we pay more and get less, and foreign producers because the amount of imports goes from I0 down to this purple one, I1. Right? So the amount of imports shrinks. So we're going to have fewer consumption possibilities than if we did it with free trade, but some workers are going to win. What are the trade-offs there, right? That's what we have to answer, along with those other concerns like environmental issues, workers' rights, and all of that. Okay. So what about a quota, right? So this is the last of the restrictions we're going to look at here. Let's see if I can get rid of some of this without making it harder. Actually, let me just redraw. That'll be easier. I can't put them all on the same graph. So let's look at I could, but it would be ugly, right? So let's look at quota restricted trade. So I'm just going to draw the basics here again. Here's domestic demand, D1, same D1 we had before. Here's supply 1, right? So it goes up. And then I'm going to, as it does on your sheet here, I'm going to dot it, right? That's what the domestic suppliers would look like, all U.S. firms. And then suppose that here's the price of free trade, right? That's the world price. Remember, if there's completely free trade, so we're not doing the tariff thing as our starting off point, we're looking at free trade. And then we're going to put a quota on. So at that price, right, of P2, The story is that we're going to put on a quota of how much we can bring in and no more. So this distance, as it says on your sheet there, is the amount of the quota. And then when we get beyond that, we'll actually have the supply look like that, right? S4, where this distance between the two is the amount of the quota. Okay. So what happens here? Well, let's put some letters on this. Where this original kink happens is QD from our previous slides. We're going to call the quantity here where the second kink happens, we're going to call that Q1. We're going to call the new equilibrium out here Q4. And what would have happened if we had completely free trade will be out here at Q2. Okay? So this is the same basic graph you had before. It just looks a little different because of the quota. So what's happening? Well, in the first phase, we know what's going on, right? These first producers here are the low-cost U.S. producers. They can compete at the global price of P2. Here's the global amount that's allowed, the imports. And the answer is they're fixed, right? You can only bring in that quantity no matter what. And so once we get up to that level of Q1, where does this production come from? U.S. firms, right? Those firms that are a little higher cost, but because demand is strong, they're going to be able to sell at this price, which is the quota determined price, which is the price of P4, okay? So we've only got the international part coming in this horizontal segment at the global price. Everything else is U.S. domestic producers. So what happens here? What's domestic production equal to? Right? That's the first blank underneath here. Well, the domestic production, how much is produced by U.S. firms and workers, is QD plus, so that's the first part, plus this segment here that's circled with the purple, and that's Q4 minus Q1, right? So the total of that is how much is produced by U.S. firms. How big are imports? Well, imports are equal to the amount of the quota here, which is equal to Q1 minus QD. Right? That's the amount that is imported. That's the amount of the quota. What's the gains in U.S. production and jobs due to the quota? Right? Well, it's this purple section again, right? If we just had free trade, we would have still had the QD, but this extra part is the gain due to putting on this quota restriction. So the Q4 minus Q1 is gain in U.S. jobs. Those workers keep their jobs. That production continues in the United States. So then, answering the questions, who wins when we have quota restricted trade? And the answer is some U.S. producers, right? Q4 minus Q1. They keep their jobs. That production stays here. Who loses because we put a quota on instead of having free trade? Consumers. They pay more, right? And get less, right, than they would have, Q4 instead of Q2. And some foreign producers lose too, because if we'd had completely free trade, imports would have been this much bigger area, but it's just that purple area because of the quota, the strict specific limit on the amount that would be allowed, okay? So consumers and some foreign producers lose. So what's the right way to go, right? Well, what this analysis does is it just shows us if we put on these restrictions, who's going to win and who's going to lose. And then we have to decide as a people what we want to pursue. What are the other issues that we care about? What is our sense of equity and fairness and justice and right and wrong and all of that stuff that economics can't fundamentally answer all by itself, okay? So, you know, the long-term trend, definitely starting really with the 1970s, but really ramping it up in the 1990s and 2000s and up to today, is the story of reducing those barriers to free trade, cutting down barriers that used to be much stronger and opening up and liberalizing markets to being much freer and more global trade. That is not necessarily without conflict. In fact, there's always conflict, and people that feel like free trade leads to worse situations, whether it's environmental depletion, environmental pollution, the story of lack of human rights, dignity, and all of the rest of those kinds of things. Very, very important. So let's turn to the last little section for this lecture, this video, and that's on page 13. I want to talk a little bit about some global multilateral trade pacts, and some key names and organizations you might hear about. First thing to talk about is a little bit of the brief history of this, which is to talk about the GATT, G-A-T-T, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. These are the historical foundation for multilateral, multi-year global trade pacts. And it started with the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, G-A-T-T. And each year, not each year, but every so often, the members of GATT would get together in different places around the world, and they would have a round of negotiations. And in 1994, that round, the GATT meetings were held in the country of Uruguay in South America. So in the Uruguay round, a lot of things happened, but one of the most notable things was that they created an organization called the World Trade Organization, right? The WTO. The World Trade Organization was created in 1994 at the Uruguay round of the GATT. And the WTO you still hear about a lot today because they have become the police force, if you will, in enforcing multilateral, multi-year trade pacts between nations. So in other words, the story is that if two countries or more than two sign a trade agreement formally, and one country comes and says to the other country, you're cheating on your agreement. You weren't going to put these tariffs on, but now you just slapped them on. The story was they can take their case with their data and their evidence to the WTO. And the WTO can then use its monetary value and its strength to try to pressure the other nation into changing their behavior or to find that the first nation was in fact incorrect. So they've become the police force in trying to monitor and enforce the rules of those trade agreements. That doesn't mean they always have the power to do that. Individual countries can say, forget about this, but then the trade pact falls apart. And so they've had a lot of strong pressure. The United States has been charged many times with violating the terms of their trade agreements, and the WTO has sort of put the knuckles down and tried to say, you need to change. And oftentimes the United States has indeed backed down because they want those trade pacts to continue for a lot of other reasons. Other nations have been accused of the same. And so the WTO is that police force. And you can see the WTO's logo there on the right side of the sheet. Now, whenever the WTO meets, of course, there are lots of protests going on talking about, well, you're not playing fair here. This is, controlled by the rich countries and they use it for their advantages and all of that. And it is a contentious sort of story. The environmentalists get together and say, we're not having protection of, our environmental resources. And human rights groups say that, well, it's great that there's free trade, but if people are being paid, $2 an hour or $2 a day or whatever, the story is that's not, respecting their rights, and it's eroding the rights of all the work that people have done to try to gain workers' rights through the years. And then, of course, there are groups that are third world countries saying this is unfair, that the playing field is not right, that there's power differentials and all of that. And so every time there's a meeting in the WTO, there are global protests. It's happened in the United States when there were the meetings in Seattle several years ago. It happens every time, almost every time. There are meetings around the globe because there's a lot to win and a lot to lose from global trade pacts for lots of people. A very eclectic group of folks that look and say, this isn't all right. There are some problems here, and it's good to know what the problems are and to think about, is there a better solution? So that's the GATT and the WTO, the basics. And then I just want to talk about some of the multilateral, multi-year trade pacts that we have. For the United States, one of the most important ones for our purposes is NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A. And it's kind of the granddaddy for us of multilateral, multi-year trade pacts. And it was signed in December of 1992 and implemented a little thereafter. And what it does is, in that situation, 3 countries, if you're filling it in there, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, right, signed it and basically agreed that our 3 countries would be a free trade zone, in the sense that goods and services could flow freely across the borders between the United States, Canada, and Mexico without tariffs, quotas, other sorts of restrictions. The only restriction, of course, is that labor can't flow freely. So we can't have vast numbers of workers going between Mexico and the United States and all of that kind of stuff. That's limited. But goods and services, duty free, tariff and import quota free. And so the story is it created a mass trading bloc. Has NAFTA been good or bad? The answer is yes, good and bad. Good in the sense that overall, the volume of trade between our nations has increased rather dramatically. And as a whole, in terms of GDP and other measures of the sizes of our economies, we have benefited from that trade. But lots of individuals have suffered. Lots of good middle class, decent wage paying jobs have gone to Mexico in particular. And the story is that they haven't come back for a lot of people. They have had a hard time finding jobs that paid as well and all that kind of stuff with job security and the rest. Other jobs have replaced them that have been good, but not enough for enough people in terms of the right skill sets and those kinds of challenges. So the answer is yes, in total, the pie has gotten bigger, but some individuals have indeed suffered and continue in some ways to suffer from those multilateral trade pacts. NAFTA is the granddaddy for the United States. Another one that's out there is DR-CAFTA, and you can look at the nations that are involved with that. Primarily, this is a story of the Dominican Republic and Central America. And so they've come up with a trade pact that looks at breaking down the barriers to trade as well. On the last page, yay, there are three more. And I want to particularly focus for a little bit on the European Union, just because it's in the news a great deal, always. And the EU, if you want to see their website, go to europa.eu and find all kinds of stuff about the European Union. But the European Union is a regional trade pact that virtually eliminates national boundaries between 28 countries, right? 28 different member states belong to the European Union. It actually was formed originally in the 1950s, 1952 specifically, and has been growing in terms of its membership for many, many years now. There are a number of states that are also candidates and potential candidate countries on the horizon that may end up joining the EU. For a long time, the EU was doing really, really, really well, and they've had some ups and downs in recent years and probably will start to recover. They've got some unique challenges going on there. I'm not going to get into all those specifics in this episode, but they're different than NAFTA in the sense that not only can goods and services flow freely across international borders, but so can people. So workers can travel all over the European Union in terms of working and all of that with very few restrictions indeed. And so that has made them into a rather united market in a dimension that we don't have in the United States between us, Canada, and Mexico. In addition, they have a common currency that has been adopted by a number of them. Starting in 1999, 11 of the European Union nations adopted the euro. And today, 17 nations use the euro as their common currency, doing away with the German mark, the French franc, and some others. You can see a map there of the member nations of the European Union, all of those that are in color. And again, they've had some issues in recent years, and we can talk about that another day or outside of the video lectures. The last two on here are just trade blocs related to South America. There's one called Mercosur, and you can take a peek at that. And then over in Southeast Asia, an organization called ASEAN, and ASEAN has been around for a long time as well. So that's some of the multilateral trade pacts that exist. And again, there are potential benefits in terms of overall countries having bigger consumption possibilities than they could produce on their own. There are also a lot of challenges with international trade. Just like there's always a situation when there's a big upside, there's potentially a big downside. This is not an all or nothing, cut and dry, black and white sort of analysis. So trade has the potential to be very good, but not everybody wins equally. That's the end of this video lecture. Have a great day.